Well, now we're very privileged to have Deborah Houlding talk to us today. I can't wait to hear the subject matter, Deb. I know it's going to be fantastic. I'm sure Deb needs no introduction. She's one of the world's greatest traditional astrologers. Her work is endless. She's the founder and tutor of the STA. Her SkyScript website is incredible, as is her book, The Houses, Temples of the Sky. She was the founder of Estella Publications, editor of the Traditional Astrologer magazine, and she's been teaching, lecturing for many decades, since the 80s, and we're really lucky to have her. She's here speaking today on behalf of the STA, and she's just a really great woman. So I'm going to pass it over to you now, Deb. Thank you so much. So great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate the big build-up, but you've set a standard for me now, so... Thank you for joining me, everybody, on what's possibly the most controversial talk. I will admit I'm not here for a popularity contest today. I'm looking at the issue of the sign, the whole sign, and nothing but the sign, really. Particularly stirred to give this presentation in view of the quote on the screen. The whole sign house system is the oldest form of house division and remained the preferred method of determining houses for about 1,000 years after its inception. That definition is all over the internet, on many credible authoritative websites, and any new student coming into astrology is obviously going to think, well, everybody's telling me this is a great house system, it's the easiest, it's the best, it's the oldest, and it was preferred for 1,000 years, so, you know, why would you not use it? Let's take a look at the issues. So I want to say that what's of interest to me is I am a pre-computer astrologer. When I started studying astrology, you had to manually calculate your charts. The internet, the World Wide Web wasn't invented. There was forms of the internet, but there wasn't a public web that we all shared. And I remember in the 80s and early 90s, there wasn't any semblance of a house system called whole sign houses. I mean, I would like to say there was zero recognition of it in the Western tradition. I don't know about Vedic systems, or Hindu astrologers using sidereal systems might have used something like that. But certainly as an astrologer that was in the community at the time, there was no awareness of anybody ever using whole sign houses, showing charts, teaching on it, talking about it, prior to the 1990s, when it was launched with a big fanfare by Project Hindsight. So, you know, this is just 30 years. We've moved from a situation where there was virtually no recognition of this system. And I would say zero, but there might have been one or two people using it, like there was some people claiming there's 13 signs in the zodiac, but it didn't exist within the mainstream astrological practice prior to the 1990s. We contrast that with today, and I don't know the statistics of what is the most popular house system. A lot of websites report that Placidus is the most popular, followed by whole sign, followed by porphyry. Certainly whole sign, I would say, has become the most popular house system for a tremendous amount of new astrologers who have come into the subject. I would say that most of them are very aware of whole sign, and the general trend is for an astrologer to believe that they are well trained, having been taught how to use whole sign houses. We can look at Astro Database, which is recently incorporated. You know, it's such an important site, Astro Databank, the way that it's my first go-to place for any chart, to get the chart data. And they now give 3 options. You can calculate a chart in Placidus, you can calculate it in whole sign, or you can calculate it in equal house, which for some reason that I don't understand, Astro Databank has decided is a system called English style. So I don't know where that is coming from or why they do that. Believe me, the equal house system is nothing to do with the English nation, but this is just an example of how popular whole sign houses have become. So I want to just very briefly look at what happened in this 30-year shift. How did we go as I say, from zero to hero in such a short space of time. And one of the problems with this talk, one of the reasons why many people have felt uncomfortable discussing this issue, is people do tend to get very emotive about the whole sign house system. And in order, for people like me that have watched the whole thing, I don't like to talk about personalities. I like to look at the theories and the principles. And so it's difficult for me to say, this happened in this way without bringing in certain personalities. But I've decided that it is not possible to look at the phenomenon of the rise of the whole sign house system without understanding the psychology of the movement behind it. So I'm going to give you my witnessed account of how I saw this system develop and get so popular. As I say, there was no definition of a whole sign house system or awareness or recognition of it at all in the historical literature and the traditional literature, or the books that have been published by the historical astrologers or people like J.D. North, who wrote about all the various house systems available, or Morin, where it outlines all the available house systems and discusses each one of them and what are the merits of this and what are the merits of that. None of them mention a system called whole sign house system or seem to be aware of this being in existence. So, we go back to that opening quote, and it was supposed to be the preferred method for 1,000 years, and yet we don't have a single historical astrologer championing it, defining it, discussing it, recommending it, or saying this is what you do. Not a single one. And the first awareness of it really came in the 1980s when James Houlding made a suggestion, quite rightly, that a lot of ancient astrologers, in his opinion, seemed to just use a very rough user sign for a house. They weren't too precise. Sometimes they didn't, give the full degrees of the planets. But James Houlding did acknowledge that, other house systems were in existence and were used. But he did make the suggestion that sometimes they just appear to be using a sign for a house. So it wasn't until the 1990s, and this was around 1993. I think Project Hindsight started up about 1992 and started, launching seriously in 1993. And they were the group that really defined the term whole sign houses. Rob Hand took to that term and personally, kind of like created the term and presented it as a system rather than a convenience that is done when you're talking about charts in abstract terms. And you might say, well, if you've got Aries on the ascendant, you're going to have Leo on the 5th house. You could be talking in abstract terms. But this is when it was defined as a system. Now, what happened around the time that Project Hindsight started up, this was around 1993, this was the same year that the World Wide Web became available to the public. So the launch of Project Hindsight corresponded with a change in social media anyway. And around that time, as part of their project, they set up user groups that you could subscribe to with them. They also sold courses, they had subscriptions. There was a lot of attention, focus, commerce, a lot of buzz around this translation project. And every astrologer at the time, who was anybody with an interest in traditional astrology, myself and everybody that worked with me on the Traditional Astrology magazine, were hugely enthusiastic, subscribed to them, wanted to really support this new project that was going to translate and make available the textbooks of the ancient astrologers. And I'll just say at that time, I had some pretty good knowledge of the scope of ancient astrology myself. I think James Houlding had an interest in translating certain works from Valens. And although the work of Valens wasn't translated in full, most of it was before Project Hindsight. I mean, this is you'll have to see from the state of this. This is my copy of Greek horoscopes, which has been, like every chart within this has been hand drawn out and analysed. And I had done that for about 3 or 4 years before Project Hindsight started. So even though they were the first to fully translate some of these works, there were those of us who could see from the start that this wasn't mirroring with what we were seeing in other translations of the same work. Anyway, just to talk a little bit more about Project Hindsight, it started off, for those who don't realise, it started off as a project with 3 Roberts, and they came together with a dream team, really. Robert Hand, Robert Schmidt, and Robert Zoller. But it's important to realise that at this time when this project started, there was only one of these Roberts that had any real understanding, training, and serious study of traditional astrology. Robert Hand is now known as being a great expert in his interest in traditional astrology and his study of medieval texts. But at the time that Project Hindsight started, Robert Hand was a big, famous, well-known, popular astrologer. His books were quite psychological, with interest in modern astrology. He was well known for being an astrology software programmer. He was involved in producing ephemerises. His books were immensely popular, and his philosophical stance on things has always been hugely appreciated and respected. So he was a big name. And I remember, as the editor of the Traditional Astrologer, it was a year or 2 after he started Project Hindsight that he came out as a traditional astrologer. And it was such a big thing for those of us that had been involved in traditional astrology for quite a while, that I actually wrote about it in the Traditional Astrology magazine and quoted him. You know, as like evidence, look, we're not all maniacs, we're not all, you know, like fuddy-duddies. Even Robert Hand is one of us now. But that was after Project Hindsight started. So he didn't come into the project with expertise in traditional astrology. Robert Schmidt was a brilliant mind trained in the study of ancient Greek and ancient Greek philosophy. He had not had any training in traditional astrology, historical astrology, or even astrological practice. He didn't come into this translation project as a practicing astrologer. The only person that came into the project with serious interest, knowledge of traditional astrology and the whole scope of the subject was Robert Zoller, who had a tremendous reputation as a translator of works from Al-Kindi, Bernati, the Arabic parts. He was a well-known traditional astrology expert. So between the 3, there was a dream team. Big popular astrologer with a very credible reputation, Greek translator, very knowledgeable on Greek philosophy, and Robert Zoller. Within only a matter of months, Robert Zoller pulled out of the project. He was not in line with the direction that it was going with. And part of what I assume this was, I did have private correspondence with Robert Zoller. He emailed me a few times in his life and shared, some of his thoughts with me. But one of the problems that we had with Project Hindsight was that this project started right from the beginning with absolute answers to everything. Even before the first text was released, they were giving us answers on this is what everybody was doing. And they weren't asking questions. They were selling a new package of astrology. It was simplified. All the aspects, there's no such things as orbs. There's no such, aspects just from one side to the other. There's no such thing as house cuss. It's just, 12 signs. You've only got to be able to count 12 and you can pretty much, get on board with this system. The teachings were not up for, and they were teachings, it was set up as a translation project, but it was the community groups. It was mainly the feeling was there was kind of a sense of everybody sits around Robert Schmidt's feet and he guru-likes, gives his philosophical slant on things. They were not up for discussion, and this wasn't a project set up to answer questions or even explore questions. It was set up to give an absolute meaning of what was happening at a stage where I would say we didn't even know what questions we should be asking at that time. So what happened was, very quickly, Robert Zoller fell out of the project. Robert Hand became, very attached to this idea that Robert Hand and Robert Schmidt promoted right from the start, that there was no such thing as house cuffs or quadrant house systems in ancient astrology. All astrologers just, just did the houses by the signs. And they would hold conclaves, and a lot of well-known American astrologers, Demetra George, Joseph Crane, Myra Epstein, Dorian Greenbaum, these were all astrologers that before Project Hindsight started, they were known for being psychological astrologers. That's was their interest. They were modern psychological astrologers. And in the conclaves, there would be lots of new astrologers brought in. Chris Brannan lived with Robert Schmidt. Ben Dykes, learned from them, attended their conclaves when he was getting into astrology. So all these new young American astrologers and the older astrologers, like people like Demetra George, very quickly shifted from their previous style of practice to this new, wholly different style of Hellenistic astrology. And within a year, people that had no previous real interest or experience in traditional astrology were teaching as a new level of, instruction of people that knew all about Hellenistic astrology and teaching it to a new generation of astrologers to come. And this happened very quickly. There was such an intense, in the middle of the 1990s, it was very intense. I was amazed by the rapidity by which some people that had never really been interested in traditional astrology before so quickly became experts. I've been studying and researching traditional astrology now for nigh on 40 years. And I will admit that I'm still getting a grasp on some things. I am still only just starting to understand some things, but that didn't have that delayed, this wasn't a project that explored and asked questions. It was pretty much an entirely American-driven movement, and it was termed a movement. It was, it was marketed as a movement. Over in Europe, we had people like Giuseppe Babza, all the people that had previously been associated with traditional astrology that had seriously studied the subject. They didn't really move on this because, we already knew some of the stuff from before anyway. And what was coming out was flying at odds with what we were seeing elsewhere. And when I say, just before I move on from this, because I don't want to make it all about this point, but one of the things Project Hindsight did was they refused to look at astrology in a context of a tradition. They didn't care what was in the Arabic text because that wasn't part of the Hellenistic texts that were being translated. They didn't care about the Babylonian texts that preceded them. They were wrong. They didn't have the view that astrology developed. They had a view that it came to one golden area at one specific moment of time, which was the time that was captured by the particular text that they were translating. And anything that followed that was a corruption that we can just forget about. So there was no, they didn't come into this with, I recognize what's happening here because this is exactly what Abu Mashar is saying in his text, or Al-Kabizi. This has been translated in the work of Al-Kabizi, and we can see the parallel. There was none of that. There was no context of things. And so lots of things that were part of the tradition before and after this period were not recognized by them. Then because, as I said, that this phenomenon happened so quickly, because then the internet developed, and then we got Wikipedia, and around about the early 2000s, there was these young, upcoming, very dynamic, passionate movement of astrologers were the ones that were feeding in the information in Wikipedia, which would then feed through to a whole myriad of websites. And you go into the back pages of Wikipedia and you can see the Wikipedia wars going on between people defining things this way, defining things that way, very keen that this particular one vision gets promoted. And I would ask you to observe that, if you look at what's being said around this subject on the internet in different places, the champions of the whole sign approach are extremely passionate about explaining it, demonstrating it, recommending it. They are intent on stressing it is better than other systems. The other systems should be abandoned because this is the best. And the arguments invariably depend on the claim that this was the original and preferred system of historical astrologers. So, this really heated discussion. But then, as I said, the number of historical astrologers who have actually explained it, taught it, recommended it, argued it, or suggested it is the best, zero. There isn't a single historical astrologer prior to the historical astrologers that we know of, prior to modern times, saying this is what you should do. Forget the other systems. This is the one that's the best. Why I use whole sign houses? Why I use whole sign houses, not the others? Not a single historical astrologer has approached the subject in that way. Nobody's talked about it. Nobody's demonstrated it. Nobody has shown awareness that it exists. Every single time an astrologer talks about the houses, they stress the importance, undeniably, of commencing division of houses from the ascendant degree. So here we get to Hero Point, and this is Co-Star, the app that I don't know much about it, but I'm sure many of you do. And the definition that is claiming that whole sign house system is the oldest form of house division and remained the preferred method of determining houses for about 1,000 years. Why does this matter? I've just gone with my life oblivious to what goes on the internet until, as a teacher of astrology, I'm constantly getting astrologers come to a course that is geared for people with good understanding and knowledge of the basics, advanced courses. And it's becoming obvious to me that those students who say that they're fully informed on house systems, they don't even know what a table of houses is. They really have no understanding of what houses are. And there's only really 4 basic principles of astrology. The zodiac sign, the houses, the planets, the aspects. And this whole issue of houses has become so poorly understood by so many astrologers who believe that they are well informed on it. Now, the Co-Star app, there's a little bit of information here. It was funded by about £15 million grant. And according to them, this is from April last year when I think this was reported. It's had more than 20 million downloads, and it's been downloaded by 1/4 of all young women aged between 18 to 25 in the US. This app is an app for calculating astrology charts so that people can do astrology. And so we are now in a position where, the internet, Twitter, and everything is absolutely flooded with millions of new astrologers with this app who are championing whole sign houses, being told that this is the preferred system. They've even given it a date as if there was some point at which whole sign system was invented. So to some extent, I may as well be controversial in this talk. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I say. There's a few of you here that are going to hear me. There's a few of you less that are going to listen to me. But at the end of the day, it makes no difference because there are millions of astrologers out there now that know that this is the best system and they are not going to change. Okay, so let's look at the arguments of why would you be using whole sign houses, why we should. Why are they the original? Why are they the best? It's all started off from Project Hindsight's declaration. Their first really important project was to translate the work of Vettius Valens. And in ancient astrology, we get a few little random charts, but Valens' work is the motherlode because that's the one with all the chart examples in it. And so when they launched their translation, they were adamant from the start that Vettius Valens only used whole sign systems. He didn't use any other system. And they plowed that out right from the start. And then when they came across passages that they translated that didn't seem to say that, it was like, now we've got to try and put an epicycle on this because this doesn't work. You need to remember that that project was funded so that they would serialize the translations. So the first book that they translated was book 1. Book 1 of Valens is the one that gives you all the instructions on how to calculate. But the Project Hindsight translation of book 1 is a very poor translation of that text. And they even within the pages just pretty much say, we don't really understand what's going on here. So, you know, they skimmed over certain passages and made it very clear to their subscribers, but, you know, this is the boring, you know, technical stuff. Wait to get to book 2, because then we're going to start talking about the lots and the, you know, practical use of this stuff. And then they really, you know, took off with book 2 and the other books. So, yeah, the other arguments of why people say it was the oldest, the original. You very often get people saying, where are the tables of houses? You know, if there was all those house systems, there weren't even tables of houses until the 7th century. And then the arguments being made that they must have been using whole sign houses because, you know, hardly any of the ancient horoscopes even had information about the midheaven. And if you don't have the midheaven, how can you calculate the houses? So therefore, they only gave the ascendant degree, which means that they were only using whole sign houses and putting the ascendant within it. Right, okay. So what happened here was that they started off from the start declaring that there was only whole sign houses. Then book 2 and book 3 get translated, and there's passages within where it's clear there's use of quadrant systems going on here. And Robert Schmidt comes up with a suggestion that, well, what they're doing when they're dividing by quadrant systems is they're just giving a sense of strength to the planet, but they were still using the whole sign houses for meanings. But that would tell you how strong a planet was. So that was a completely new theory that had never been heard of before, that you would do 2 kinds of houses, one to tell you how strong a planet is, and another one to tell you what it means in the houses. It was all very uncomfortable for those of us that had a different scope on things. But Robert Schmidt never translated book 9. And he never has translated book 9. It just all got abandoned. And it wasn't until Mark Riley released his English translation for the public that we could all see that Mark Riley had translated book 9 of Balance. And book 9 is absolutely crystal clear that you cannot believe that Vettius Valens only used whole sign houses. So some of the quotes from book 9, where the system of the houses are dated back to the Egyptians and the ancient antiquity by Valens. And he tells us that they were discussed by the Chaldeans and Asclepius, who is very, very ancient source. And he describes the houses and how they start from the ascendant, and then he describes what they mean. And he tells us that these distinctions between the things indicated by the places are explained elsewhere, which is previously where he's told us how to calculate it. And he tells us it's necessary to calculate the positions of the places in degrees. And he tells us that often 2 places will fall on one sign and will indicate both qualities. So you might need to look at the ruler of both signs when you're evaluating the matters of that house. If it is calculated that each place exactly corresponds to each sign in the chart as a whole, a circumstance which is rare, so clearly he's not using whole sign houses because that would be the case every time, then the native will be involved in confinement, violence, and entangling affairs. So he goes so far as to say, if there is an equality of houses and signs, this is a bad thing. And I guess one of the reasons why it could be a bad thing is because anybody that knows about the principles of the placement of cusps, if cusps are in very early degrees, that suggests, you know, change and disturbance or a very immature understanding of something. So for an historical astrologer to see all the house cusps falling in early degrees or end degrees, you know, that's loading it up with negative symbolism. But it's absolutely clear that Vettius Valens did not only use whole sign houses, which was the whole premise that the whole argument got launched on. It might be forgotten now, but at the time, it was because that's what was assumed from the work of Vettius Valens. Now, Robert Schmidt, at the end of his life, did admit that, you know, did change his stance, and hopefully this will play. I'll just play you 1 minute of Robert Schmidt speaking about a year before he died.
The houses discussed.
Sorry, just let me go back to that. I'll just explain that was an interview with Eric Francis, and it was a 2-hour interview, and they were just closing and they were just about to end the interview, but they just caught a little comment on the houses.
The houses discussion is a beautiful one because it's a topic dear to my heart, and I think that it's being overly simplified by the fundamentalist Republican classical astrologers.
I am certain of that, and I mean, I'm partly responsible for the whole sign house movement. I mean, simply because we found all kinds of texts that were talking about whole sign places, but you cannot conclude from the prevalence of whole sign places in different texts that they were either the original system or the dominant system. In fact, that's not really even true. There are all kinds of references to a system of equal places. Iturbicus Eternus, Balance, was anonymous papyrus thing, another text that I've never published, Ptolemy. I mean, it's all over the place. It has to be accounted for. But everyone is thinking so much, that they're variant systems, because we've got variant house systems today. But that would, a Greek isn't going to do that. We're going to have two completely different systems. I mean, that would be like a terrible flaw.
Okay, so I just wanted to make that point because that was Schmidt at the end of his life, and it was singing a very different tune from the passion that the Project Hindsight message was delivered with, which was mostly taken up by Robert Hand. And Robert Hand is usually quoted as the person that gives the whole sign argument because he wrote a book defending it. And I think that it has to be borne in mind that Robert Hand's book is an argument in favor of the argument that he made himself. It is not a book written by somebody that is critiquing the argument, but he was the person that proposed the system, and his book is written with many points that are slanted towards supporting what he wants to say. And one of the big things he said, the arguments that he made was the issue about the midheaven, and he did a whole database of how many times a chart uses the midheaven, and this proves that they must have been using whole sign houses. So let me just tell you a little bit about, I don't know, we'll just let that table land for a moment. This is an indication of where we are in the modern age, that we now have tables of houses for whole signs. Anyway, there was, so going back, I think I'm losing my place a little bit. I want to show you, what do I want to show you here? Let me go back. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I just don't want people to think that I'm just sitting here, I've got no real investment. I don't translate Greek, and that's true. But as I said, I've had a very, very long, sincere interest in ancient works, even before Project Hindsight started. And what I'm showing you here is, work that I haven't yet been able to publish, but it's a annotated edition of Mark Riley's translation of Vettius Valens, where what I bring to the table is not a knowledge of Greek, but I bring an overview of placing it into older works, contemporary works, later works. And what I wanted to do was work on book one. As I said, book one, Project Hindsight, they brushed through it and just don't really understand what's happening here. He must be making mistakes, blah, 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 blah. Nobody has made a good job of interpreting book one. I armed myself with the Project Hindsight version, the Andrea Gertz version, the Mark Riley version, every extract that I could find, and studied them all. I beat my head against the wall so many times because I could not understand what was being said, but I had, some kind of compulsive obsession disorder that made me not be able to turn away from this work until I understood what he was trying to say. And so, in annotating this, what I realized was that Valens gives the full set of instructions that you need to calculate a chart in full. And because we don't understand the methods, it seems that we don't know how to do it. But he doesn't provide the tables, but he gives you the instruction within this work so that you know how to calculate your own set of tables. And then following his formula, you then get everything you need to calculate a full chart. And I've hope to have this available probably early next year. Just I will make it for free release so everybody can see it. But if you follow what he's saying, and that's all I've done on this, is just follow his instruction. And I will just say that I am not a mathematical genius in any sense. I can add, I can subtract, I can multiply and divide. I don't understand anything technical beyond that. One of the reasons I love Valence's work is because once you understand what he's trying to say, it makes it easy. And suddenly, oh my goodness, I get it. I can do it. I can actually do this myself. I can actually, just knowing a few basic principles, calculate where everything is. I don't need a computer. I don't even need an ephemeris. So this idea of where are the tables of houses, they were in every work. They were in Ptolemy's Almagest. They're in Firmicus's work, where he gives the table of rising signs. They're in Valens, where he gives the table of rising signs and tells us how to use it. Until in the end, what we end up with, and this chart here is my version of the chart that he's instructed us to calculate. And we know that this is the chart that later on in a later book, he describes it in full. And this is drawn on a computer, and this is the one that's calculated just using the references that he gives us in his text. So that was an eye-opener to me that, you know, there is nothing we're lacking. And if I can return to my PowerPoint. Yeah, so what happened was, when I realized this, there was something very strange happened. They were watching the arguments about people saying, but they didn't know the midheaven, so they couldn't do it. And I said, but do you know what? Valens has told us, we don't need to know the degree of the midheaven. The only thing you need to know is the ascendant degree. That's all you need to know, the ascendant degree and the latitude. Then you use the rising times and you get the midheaven, and it's as easy as anything once you have constructed your own table. And I did a little experiment on Twitter, you know, when I just said, I'll just test this out. Somebody give me an ascendant, let's say Turkey, you know, and you can choose any day of your year, any time, any day, any month. Give me an ascendant and I'll tell you. And people thought I was psychic because I was returning with the information. So let me just stress this. I was really surprised. I think I lost my relevant. Oh yeah, this is the slide where, you know, I was having the conversation. And I was at that stage thinking, wow, this is amazing. I didn't know that you could do this. And you can all do it. So here's a little test for you all. You will all know where you were born, and you will all know what your ascendant is. Now, you think that midheaven is the midheaven you have at that time and place. No. Take the place you were born and put your ascendant, the degree of your ascendant, on the ascendant any time, any day of the year, any day of the year, any month, any day of the year. You will still have the same degree on the midheaven. So if somebody tells me what their ascendant degree is, and I know where they're born, I can tell them with precision what their midheaven is. And I only know that because I have worked through the text of Valens, and that came as like, whoa, I didn't know this could be done. Paul Kiernan, who had also independently done his own study, was the one that, you know, made it clear to me that actually, yeah, it works in his text, but don't you know that you can computerize it? So it works with precision because it is a reliable astronomical principle. So we can forget about the fact that they didn't know the midheaven. It was like, it was like, I don't need to tell you that Leo is the 5th sign from Aries. You know the zodiac, and I'll tell you it's the 5th sign. Figure it out. You can know that. You don't need it putting into tables. Now, another thing about this is the presentation that we give to charts is very deceptive. And when this book was published, it was published with charts included that was set up in the whole sign system, making it look like all the ancient charts were set that way. We have hardly any images of ancient charts, and none of the examples in Valens' work were showing chart graphics. None of them. They were just text examples and comments. So he'd be saying like, okay, so imagine the ascendant is in Aries at this degree, then you're going to have this part in this degree. And he's, you know, little snippets of details, but not illustrated charts. The diagram here is a piece of graffiti from an ancient astrologer in classical times. And the diagram up here is the oldest dated visual representation of a chart that we possess. This was for a chart dated to 478. And this is my English transliteration of it. And it is drawn according to the porphyry house system. And that is the first one that we have. We simply do not have representation of charts from that period. If I was to draw a chart like that, it would be more in keeping, because it's got an upright midheaven and it's got the midheaven at the top, than, you know, than something like, maybe I'll show it later.
Yeah.
Sorry, did somebody have a question? Oh no, that was Robert Smith's recording, sorry. Okay, so this idea that, you know, there was this lack of technical knowledge in the ancient period would have been horrifying to Vettius Valens. I am absolutely sure that Valens would be turning in his grave if he knew how much his work was being simplified and bastardized to make an argument that was completely opposite to what he makes in his own work, where he cares about serious attention and getting details right. This is an example from Greek horoscopes where they're explaining how to calculate the degrees, the cancer of the 12 loci, which is the 12 houses. And this is somebody explaining how Ptolemy did it. Now, when you follow the instruction in this, you actually get what we call the Alcibiades house system. And the Alcibiades house system was known as that because, you know, he used it and he was a popular Arabic astrologer, but it was known to be used much more anciently. And most of the ancient astrologers knew it as the standard system. So Al-Biruni talks about it, or it's either the standard system or the common system of using houses. So basically in the ancient period, you've got porphyry, which is the widely known method because it's very easy to divide, you get the angles and then you divide the space between them by simply dividing them by 3. Or if you want to be more technical, then you would refer to Ptolemy's Almagest, and then you would be able to work out the hour circles, and you would divide the cusp more exactly. So no, the whole sign houses are not the oldest house system. They're not the original. The symbolism of the houses comes from the symbolism of the sky and the symbolism of time. And the use of houses, we can assume, is as old as the knowledge of time itself. Now, I wrote a book about the symbolism of the houses. And one of the reasons why I felt compelled to write that book was because there was such a mesh at the time of astrologers thinking that the meaning of the houses came from the meanings of the signs of the zodiac. So the first house means what Aries means what Mars means. You know, there's no differentiation. So I wrote the book to say the zodiac has its set of symbolism, the houses has its set of symbolism, and they unite in interpretation, but one doesn't originate the other. They are separate symbolic constructs. And when we're looking at the houses, we're bringing in the symbolism of the local space. So it's a different form of logic. And when I wrote the book, it was very controversial because at that time I wasn't singing the popular song that, you know, Aries is the first house. But I got those ideas. There was nobody else that had written that material in that way. I got that from the study of traditional texts, from ancient Babylonian astrology, from knowledge of ancient Etruscan liver divination, of knowing that certain qualities attached to the west, the rising to the east, that planets gaining strength as they culminate in the sky, that as they get past the angle, they become cadent and they lose their strength. And that all these details about culmination and foundation are the symbolic principles are related to the strength of position in the sky. So you can't separate strength of position from the meaning because it generates the meaning. So recently I saw a post on Twitter where somebody was saying, well, you know, I'm really interested in quadrant house systems, but the thing is, it's only whole sign houses that give us this match between the meanings of the houses, and like the fifth house is good. And this guy used quite a dated copy of one of my diagrams, actually. I thought, oh, I know that diagram, I did it. And then I realized that, you know, he's presenting my work in a very false way, because he's right. I'll just quickly move over to what I said at the time. Like, yes, there is a meaning built into houses, such that the fifth house, for example, is a good house because it conveys the meaning of the trine. But the meaning of the trine comes from a more fundamental source of the symbolism. It comes from the number 3 and the shape of the triangle. And that is invested into the meaning of the aspect. And it is also invested into the meaning of the houses. But the houses are not showing us the signs of the zodiac. This is not showing the ecliptic belt. This is showing local space. And when you use a quadrant house system, the meridian is always dividing the sky. You face the meridian and you're facing south. You've got north behind you. You've got east on your right. You've got right or left. I might get them mixed up. But you've got east rising, west retiring, and everything about ancient astrology and the symbolism was about quartering that division of sky and then dividing the spaces between them. And there was no ancient astrologer who was not interested in seeing what culminates in the sky, what rises and what sets. So those angles have always been very important. And that's where the symbolism comes in, because when you have a set of houses, that's showing me my local space. If I'm in the middle of this, then the houses are always going to show you the midheaven is always going to be in square to the ascendant, always. Those 12 divisions of houses are fixed. They don't move. They vary according to the different ways that we calculate them, but they're all aiming to do the same thing, which is equally divide the space between where a planet rises, where it culminates, and where it sets. So within that, it is only the quadrant house systems that have this mirroring or reconnection of the meaning of the shape, the meaning of the number, and the meaning of the house. Because as you know, when you do it by quadrant houses, you're not going to get an equal match of signs and houses. The celestial sphere is a perfect circle. It is always divided by 490-degree angles. When you put the ecliptic, oblique circle of the ecliptic inside it, it has to be squashed, it has to be stretched, because that is not a perfectly circular circle of space around us. It's projected into it. So one of the things I really want to bash home at the moment is, like constantly seeing new websites appear, informing people of what the astrological chart is, and giving the suggestion that first we have the basic chart wheel. The 12 subdivisions of the circle or wedges of the pie represent the 12 signs of the zodiac. No, they don't. They never have. They represent the 12-fold division of the local space around us. And that is what the modern generation or the young generation, many of them are failing to understand, because they've been programmed to think that it's all about showing the zodiac. And they don't realize that astrology was like 2,000 years in development before the zodiac even got equalized into 12 neat sides. And still, the issues of angularity were very important. So I know I got to rush to get to the end of this, but I'm getting there now. This is a good diagram for illustrating what the symbolic principles of the houses come from. Houses come from diurnal motion. Every day, as you think about the sun, it rises in the east and it culminates in the south and it sets in the west. And it's that rising and retiring and then transforming at midnight and coming back again. Read my book if you haven't read it already. That is where the meaning of the houses arrive from, as well as the shapes that are formed between these areas of sky around us and other issues too. The zodiac, which is the house motion, the motion of the houses is the primary motion. It follows the diurnal motion of a planet on a daily basis, rising, culminating, and retiring in the sky. The zodiac deals with secondary motion, over the course of the year, the sun will move westward through the zodiac, completing the circle in your 12 months. And then the positions of planets within that oblique circle are projected in our scheme to give them meaning. But unless you want to practice an astrology that is only looking at a circle of the zodiac and not connecting to how all that fits within the local space around you, then you can't expect that the zodiac is forming the basis of these divisions. And I also want to say here that one of the points that gets said for these equal house divisions is that they fix the problem of the poles, because with quadrant house systems, there's a problem. The systems break down in the polar regions. That problem can't be fixed. It can't be fixed whatever you do, whether you use whole sign houses, equal houses. The issue with the poles is that once you get beyond a certain extreme latitude, the ecliptic-based systems, they cannot appear in the sky. The sky doesn't have the zodiac as a circle around us. So there is no way to have a system which actually presents everything as a circle around us when it's not a circle around us. So that's a fundamental problem of astrology, no matter what you do, and it's not fixed by using an equal house. It's kind of like maybe it masks it a little bit, but you still got the same problem there. You've still got the same problem that certain planets can never culminate. They can't ever retire. So you can't use any house system that is showing the symbolism of a planet declining over the western horizon when it never does that. But that's another issue. No time to think about it. I got a couple of minutes left, and I want to just very quickly bring in this wonderful point that my friend and colleague Wade Cave put together in his own exploration of this issue. And remembering that this symbolism of houses comes from primary motion, this idea of rising. So 12th house is imprisonment. When you rise up to the 11th house, you get this sense of release. When you get up to the 10th house, you start to culminate. And Wade's got a few graphics here that just illustrate one of the problems of whole sign houses. So here's a chart cast for 8:15 a.m. in the morning. Look at the position of the moon. Okay, it's on the ascendant. Now look at the position of the moon 1 hour later, 9:15. But now look at the position of the moon another hour later, sunk back into the 12th house again. And now we look an hour later and look where it is. So this, just look at this again. These are hourly snapshots of the house placement of the moon. Going up, going down, going up. And so this whole concept of rise, decline, gaining strength, and a planet, maturing, which is built into that system of the houses, is just all taken apart with the whole sign house systems. And I just really want to end, I guess, by saying that I don't believe the word system is even appropriate. I think that it is an approach. It is something that is done, but it's done through convenience, and it's done sometimes through laziness, but it's not what any of the ancient astrologers champion us to do, encourage us to do. And the suggestion that the other systems were not a part of ancient astrology, I think it's insulting to the work of those astrologers. So I think it's time that, okay, I'm not going to be a very popular person after this talk, but I need to put my thoughts on record, and that's what they are.
Do type any questions.
Okay, so here's another point I'll leave you all to think. The other thing that I'm thinking about just lately is that in the whole of the history of astrology, this is what's called a standard chart presentation. The 10th house is always at the top. It always crowns the chart. The 4th house is always the foundation of the chart. And whenever you look through historical charts, they stylize them. They do wonderful artistic things, but they never take the 10th house away from the top. It is the crown of the chart. It is the crown. That's the reason why it means the king. It's only since the 1900s that we've come up with this chart form called the proportional chart form, where we're no longer seeing a chart done with equal divisions which is clearly to reflect the equal division of space around us. And all of a sudden, in France, by a movement of astrologers who don't like the houses, so they don't care about the houses, they want to give the emphasis to the zodiac instead, start coming up with something called proportional, and they start to make the sign divisions equal within the wheel. And that has now become the standard. It's not called the standard. The other method is called the standard because that's the way that it's always been presented. What's called the proportional one has become the most popular. When you go on the internet, every chart calculation program will by default do the chart without the midheaven being at the top, which perpetuates this false notion that these 12 divisions are about dividing the zodiac. They never were. And, you know, so the other thing that I'm on a mission to do is get people to realize that the historical method of presentation is the standard method of presentation that does connect the symbolism of the houses and the symbolism of the zodiac and the aspects and everything else together as it should. And a proportional system, many people believe that they are being traditional now because they go for a proportional system because it allows them to see the terms printed within. But that proportional house system is so counter to the philosophy and allows us to break understanding of what the philosophy means, that we're losing more than we gain from it. So I just want to bring that point as well. I think
Brilliant. Fabulous, Deb.
I'm sorry I was so quick, but I just knew I needed 3 hours for this, Wendy.
Yeah, I know, it was great. It's great, exactly. Do put any questions in. I know there's lots of comments and lots of great people loving this, Deb. So,
well, that's just an amazing surprise because even when I wrote my book about the houses and it talks about that, and I would feel like people were throwing cabbages at me at the time, like, oh, like I was really braced for like, I know I'm not going to be like, but you know what? I don't know how long I got left, and I need to put these thoughts on record because I just need to put
absolutely
my record before I go, and what people make of it is really up to them.
Absolutely. And Scott's asked, do we know how the non-decimal point was used for delineation?
Well, it wasn't until recent times because they just used the midheaven to, because remember, it's about the symbolism of the highest point. And those 12 places are fixed. If you look at the horizon and the meridian, because that's what it's representing, the horizon and the meridian, that's the cross of matter. The meridian that divides from east to west, and everything on that side is east, everything on that side is west, and then above and below. And those never shift. They are talked about as if they are firmaments in the heaven. The zodiac whirls over and across them, but they don't shift. So there doesn't really seem to be any use of the nonsense, whatever.
Brilliant. That was great. Thank you so much, Deb. That's so cool. So cool. Lots of people putting in yeah, Jeanette notes that perhaps it was understood more in Vedic.
No, in Vedic, they had a different system. They did have a different system. And like, I would never suggest, for example, I don't know anything about Chinese astrology, but I believe that it's a great system. And I believe that the Vedic system is great in its own term. But I'm talking about the transition of astrology that came from Mesopotamia, Persia, came through the Hellenistic culture, through the Romans, through the Arabian culture and all the Arabian scientists, over to the medieval Latinists. And what you might want to say is that the Arabian science was wonderful. They were translating the works of the Almagest. The Greek science, Alexandria, was wonderful. But in the European Dark Ages, we were not pot astronomers. And, I don't know that there was great astronomical knowledge in India at that time, but I don't know. But it's a whole new subject. So there could be something there, but it's a different system.
Great. Wow. Thanks so much, Deb. That was just amazing. Thank you. So looking forward to this. It was great. So cool. So cool. Okay.
Oh,
Well,
Share. Oh, yeah, there we go.
brilliant.